Black woman's act of kindness saves stranger in crisis. Blood stained the pristine white tile of the hospital bathroom floor. Eleanor Williams, a 67-year-old black woman with silver-streaked hair and steady hands, knelt beside the unconscious stranger, a well-dressed white man in his 70s who now lay pale and unmoving against the cold floor. His expensive suit was rumpled, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. "Sir, can you hear me?" Eleanor pressed her fingers against his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. The man's eyes fluttered briefly, unfocused. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of her 30 years as a retired nurse. She glanced at the orange prescription bottle that had fallen from his hand, pills scattered across the floor. Eleanor pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, dialing 911. "Emergency services, what's your situation?" "I need an ambulance at Memorial Hospital, 5th floor bathroom near the cancer ward," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Elderly male, approximately 75, possible cardiac event, unconscious but breathing." She paused, looking at the pill bottle. "Maybe a medication interaction. He's taking warfarin. There's significant bleeding." The man's breathing grew more labored. Eleanor placed her hand on his chest, feeling it rise and fall unevenly. "Ma'am, what's your relationship to the patient?" the dispatcher asked. Eleanor hesitated, looking down at the unconscious stranger. I don't know him. I just found him here. Is there anyone else with you who might know him?" "No, we're alone. Please hurry." As she set the phone down on speaker, Eleanor removed her cardigan and carefully placed it beneath the man's head. Then she took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I don't know who you are," she whispered, "but you're not alone. I'm staying right here with you." His fingers twitched in response, and for a moment his eyes opened. They were a pale, washed-out blue filled with confusion and fear. "Margaret," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm Eleanor," she corrected gently. "Help is coming." The man's eyes drifted closed again, but his grip on her hand tightened. In the distance, Eleanor could hear the sound of running footsteps. "In here," she called out, never letting go of the stranger's hand. "But let's go back to how this all started." It was just 3 hours earlier when Eleanor Williams boarded the crosstown bus to Memorial Hospital, unaware that by day's end, her life would be forever intertwined with a stranger's. The number 42 bus rumbled down Adams Avenue on a crisp autumn morning in 1993. Eleanor Williams sat with perfect posture near the front, her nurse's uniform freshly pressed, her practical shoes polished despite their age. At 67, Eleanor carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of service, 30 years as a pediatric nurse, a mother to 3 successful children, and now a grandmother to 5. Today, however, Eleanor wasn't headed to work. Those days were behind her. Instead, she was making her monthly visit to Memorial Hospital's cancer ward, where her best friend Loretta was undergoing her 3rd round of chemotherapy. The bus driver, a heavy-set man named Frank who had driven this route for as long as Eleanor had ridden it, called out to her as she gathered her things. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Mrs. Williams? How's that friend of yours doing?" Eleanor appreciated that Frank remembered. "She's fighting, Frank. Loretta's always been a fighter." "Tell her Frank's still praying for her," he said, slowing to her stop. "I will, thank you kindly." Eleanor stepped off the bus, clutching a small insulated bag containing Loretta's favorite lemon tea and homemade corn muffins. Simple comforts for difficult days. As she walked the 3 blocks to Memorial, Eleanor thought about how much had changed since she first walked these streets in the 1960s. Back then, being one of the few black nurses at the hospital meant enduring suspicious glances, backhanded compliments, and sometimes outright hostility. She had persevered, letting her work speak for itself. Now, 30 years later, former colleagues still greeted her with respect when she visited. The automatic doors of Memorial Hospital slid open, releasing a rush of antiseptic-scented air. Eleanor nodded at the security guard, then made her way to the elevator bank. As she waited, she noticed a tall, distinguished-looking white man in an expensive suit standing nearby, checking his watch repeatedly. He looked to be in his 70s, with neatly combed silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. When the elevator arrived, Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter first, but he gestured for her to go ahead. "After you, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of old money and private schools. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, stepping inside. They rode in silence to the 5th floor. As the doors opened, the man checked his watch again, his expression darkening. Eleanor couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in his hand, a detail her nurse's eyes caught automatically. Both stepped out onto the oncology floor. The familiar sounds and smells brought Eleanor back to her working days, the quiet beeping of machines, hushed conversations, the squeaking of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. She headed toward room 547, where Loretta would be waiting. As she walked, Eleanor passed the nurse's station, where a young nurse named Diane, one of Eleanor's former trainees, was speaking tensely with the man from the elevator. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington, but visiting hours for non-family members don't start until 2 o'clock, Diane explained patiently. "This is ridiculous," the man, Mr. Harrington, replied, his voice rising slightly. "I've flown in from Boston specifically to see Charles. I'm his oldest friend." "I understand, sir, but the policy is in place to allow patients to rest and spend time with immediate family. Mr. Whitley's condition requires—" "I know what his condition requires. I've known Charles for 50 years. Surely you can make an exception." Eleanor slowed her pace, not wanting to eavesdrop, but noticing the flush creeping up Diane's neck, a sign the young nurse was becoming flustered. "I wish I could, Mr. Harrington, but then find me someone who can," he interrupted sharply. Eleanor continued walking, shaking her head slightly. In her experience, hospital policies rarely bent, even for wealthy men in expensive suits. She found room 547 and knocked gently before entering. Loretta Jenkins sat propped up against pillows, a colorful scarf wrapped around her head where her salt and pepper curls had once been. Despite the obvious toll of her treatment, Loretta's eyes lit up when she saw Eleanor. "There she is, right on time as always," Loretta said, extending her arms for a hug. Eleanor embraced her friend carefully, mindful of the IV line. "Brought your favorite," she said, placing the insulated bag on the bedside table. I can smell those corn muffins. You're an angel, Ellie." Eleanor pulled up a chair and began unpacking the tea and muffins. "How are you feeling today? Truth now." Loretta sighed. "Like I've been hit by a truck, then backed over for good measure. But I'm still here, and that's something." "That's everything," Eleanor corrected, pouring the tea into a paper cup. They fell into comfortable conversation, the way only friends of 40 years could. They had met during the Memphis sanitation workers' strike in 1968, both young women trying to make a difference in a world that seemed determined to keep them in their place. Their friendship had endured through marriages, children, divorces, and now cancer. "Did you bring the photos of little Maya's birthday?" Loretta asked. Eleanor nodded, pulling out an envelope of photographs. 5 years old and already telling everyone she's going to be a doctor. "Just like her grandmother," Loretta said with a smile. As they looked through the photos, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention, raised voices, then the sound of something falling. "What on earth?" Loretta frowned. "Let me check," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. Old habits died hard. 3 decades of responding to hospital emergencies had conditioned her to investigate disturbances. In the hallway, a young orderly was kneeling beside a toppled food tray, mopping up spilled soup. Standing over him was Mr. Harrington from the elevator, his face flushed with anger. "Watch where you're going, young man," Mr. Harrington was saying, brushing at his trousers where soup had splashed. "I'm sorry, sir," the orderly, a young black man barely out of his teens, replied, keeping his eyes down. "I didn't see you coming around the corner." Eleanor recognized the careful neutrality in the young man's voice, the same tone she had taught her sons to use when confronted by angry white men in positions of authority. "Clearly," Mr. Harrington replied coldly. He checked his watch again, that same tremor visible in his hand. "Now I need to find a restroom to clean this up." "There's one just down the hall on the right, sir," the orderly said, still focused on cleaning the mess. Mr. Harrington walked away without acknowledging him. Eleanor approached the young man. "Need some help, honey?" she asked, already reaching for extra napkins from a nearby cart. The orderly looked up, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, ma'am, I appreciate it." "Don't let it bother you," Eleanor said quietly as they cleaned. "Some people forget their manners when they're worried about loved ones." "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "He's been asking about Mr. Whitley in 539. That's a tough case." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. She had seen enough in her years of nursing to know what tough case usually meant. After helping the orderly, Eleanor returned to Loretta's room where her friend was watching a rerun of The Golden Girls on the small television mounted on the wall. "Nothing serious," Eleanor reported, settling back into her chair. "Just a spilled tray." Loretta hummed, her eyes growing heavy. The chemotherapy often left her exhausted. "Would you mind if I rest my eyes for a bit, Ellie? These medications make me so drowsy." "Of course not, you rest. I'll be right here." As Loretta dozed, Eleanor thumbed through an old issue of Reader's Digest. The steady rhythm of her friend's breathing and the quiet hum of the hospital around her were oddly comforting, the familiar soundtrack to much of her adult life. After about an hour, Eleanor decided to stretch her legs while Loretta slept. She stepped out into the hallway, noticing that the usual calm efficiency of the oncology floor seemed disrupted. Nurses were gathered at the station, speaking in hushed tones. Diane spotted Eleanor and hurried over. "Mrs. Williams, thank goodness. Have you seen that man who was trying to visit Mr. Whitley earlier, Mr. Harrington?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not since the incident with the food tray. Is something wrong?" Diane bit her lip. "Mr. Whitley passed away about 20 minutes ago. His wife was with him. We've been trying to locate Mr. Harrington to tell him, but no one's seen him since he went to clean up." "Oh, that's terrible news," Eleanor said softly. "The restroom, perhaps the orderly directed him there." "We checked the men's room near the elevator. He wasn't there." Eleanor thought for a moment. "There's another one down by the sunroom at the end of the east wing. Have you looked there?" "Not yet. Would you mind checking the women's restroom while I have someone check the other men's room, just in case he got confused?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, her concern growing. She remembered the tremor in Mr. Harrington's hand, his agitation. Grief could do strange things to people, especially the elderly. Eleanor made her way to the women's restroom, finding it empty. On her way back, she passed the closed door of the East Wing men's room. Something made her pause, a gut feeling developed over years of emergencies and critical decisions. She knocked firmly on the door. "Hello, is anyone in there?" No response came, but Eleanor's instincts were firing now. She pushed the door open slightly. "Excuse me, maintenance," she called, using the old trick that had allowed her to check on male patients when necessary during her nursing days. When no protest came, she pushed the door wider and stepped inside. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Mr. Harrington lay sprawled on the floor, unconscious, a small pool of blood forming where his head had struck the edge of the sink as he fell. An orange prescription bottle lay nearby, pills scattered across the white tile floor. And now we've returned to where we started, Eleanor kneeling beside the unconscious man, calling for help, refusing to leave him alone in his moment of crisis. Eleanor called out, already reaching for the emergency call button. Medical staff rushed in, pushing Eleanor gently but firmly aside. She watched from the doorway as they worked to stabilize Richard, administering medications and adjusting his oxygen. Dr. Patterson appeared at her side. "We need to take him up to the cardiac unit immediately. It would be best if you waited here, Mrs. Williams." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, stepping back as they prepared to move Richard. As they wheeled him past, his eyes found hers briefly, fear evident in their pale blue depths. Once they had gone, Eleanor found herself at loose ends in the busy emergency room. She should go home, there was nothing more she could do here, yet something kept her rooted in place, a sense of unfinished business. She approached the charge nurse again. "Is there a waiting area where I could sit for a while?" The nurse gave her a curious look, but directed her to a small room with uncomfortable plastic chairs and outdated magazines. Eleanor settled in, picking up a dog-eared copy of National Geographic from 1991. 2 hours passed. Eleanor had read about the fall of the Berlin Wall, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, and the plight of Bengal tigers when Dr. Patterson finally appeared in the doorway, looking surprised to find her still there. "Mrs. Williams, you didn't have to wait. How is he?" Eleanor asked, setting aside the magazine. "Stabilized for now. We had to place a temporary pacemaker." "The cardiologist is with him." Dr. Patterson hesitated. "We found a contact in his wallet, his attorney in Boston. Apparently Mr. Harrington has no immediate family. The attorney is trying to reach someone named Margaret Harrington, possibly a former wife." "The name he called out," Eleanor murmured. "Yes, the attorney seemed concerned when we mentioned Mr. Harrington was asking for her. Apparently they've been divorced for nearly 30 years. Eleanor processed this information, thinking about the loneliness it suggested, a man whose emergency contact was his attorney, who called out for a woman who had left his life 3 decades ago. "Is there anything else I can help with?" she asked. Dr. Patterson shook his head. "You've done more than enough already, Mrs. Williams. We have your contact information if we need to follow up about how you found him." Eleanor nodded, gathering her purse. As she stood to leave, Dr. Patterson added, "He asked about you when he regained consciousness upstairs, wanted to know if the kind lady with the silver hair was still here." This gave Eleanor pause. "He's alone in a strange city," she said, more to herself than to the doctor. "And he just lost his friend." Dr. Patterson seemed to understand her unspoken question. "He's in room 323 in the cardiac unit if you wanted to look in on him before you leave. Just briefly, though, he needs rest." "Thank you, doctor." Eleanor made her way to the 3rd floor, memories flooding back with each familiar turn. How many thousands of times had she walked these corridors, checking on patients, mentoring young nurses, comforting worried parents? The hospital had changed, new paint, updated equipment, unfamiliar faces, but its essence remained the same. She found room 323 and knocked softly before entering. Richard Harrington lay against white pillows, looking frail and diminished without his suit jacket and commanding presence. A temporary external pacemaker was connected to leads disappearing beneath his hospital gown. His eyes opened at her approach, recognition dawning slowly. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "you're still here." "I wanted to check on you before I left," she replied, standing at the foot of his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule." Richard attempted a smile that came out as more of a grimace. "Apparently my heart decided today was a good day to misbehave spectacularly." "Hearts have terrible timing," Eleanor agreed. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unasked questions. "They told me about Charles," Richard finally said, "that he passed before I could see him." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "I'm very sorry for your loss." 50 years of friendship," Richard said, staring at the ceiling. "We met at Harvard in '43, just before we both shipped out for the war. He went to the Pacific, I went to Europe." His voice grew distant with memory. "We promised to meet back on campus after it was over, and we did." Eleanor listened, recognizing the need to speak about the departed to make their memory real through words. "Charles was the best man at my wedding," Richard continued. "Stood by me through the divorce, too, though that couldn't have been easy. His wife, Barbara, and Margaret were close." "Margaret was your wife?" Eleanor asked gently. Richard's expression tightened. "Yes, for 22 years. He shifted uncomfortably in the bed. "The doctor mentioned they're trying to contact her. That's not necessary." "Is there someone else they should call?" "The doctor mentioned an attorney." "Franklin can handle things. He always does." Richard attempted nonchalance, but the monitors betrayed the increase in his heart rate. "I don't need anyone fussing. I'll be back in Boston as soon as they release me." Eleanor recognized the stubborn independence in his tone. She had heard it from countless elderly patients over the years, particularly men of Richard's generation who equated needing help with weakness. "The doctor mentioned you might need surgery for a permanent pacemaker," she said carefully. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "I'll have it done in Boston. My cardiologist is at Mass General." Before Eleanor could respond, a nurse entered to check Richard's vitals and medication. "I should be going," Eleanor said. "It's getting late." Richard's expression shifted, a momentary flash of something like disappointment crossing his features before his composed mask returned. "Of course. Thank you for checking on me, Eleanor, and for finding me earlier. The doctor said I might not have made it if you hadn't come along when you did." "Just happened to be in the right place," Eleanor demurred. As she turned to leave, Richard called after her. "Eleanor, would you come back tomorrow? If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to properly thank you when I'm not quite so." He gestured at the medical equipment surrounding him. Eleanor hesitated only briefly. "I'll be here in the morning. I'm visiting my friend Loretta upstairs again anyway." Relief visibly washed over Richard's face. "Thank you." Outside in the hospital parking lot, Eleanor waited for the bus that would take her back to her modest home in the historically black neighborhood where she had lived for 40 years. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, she found herself thinking about Richard Harrington, about the loneliness that seemed to envelop him despite his wealthy appearance, about the way he had called out for a woman who had left his life decades ago, about the friendship with Charles that had spanned half a century and ended just hours too soon. Eleanor's husband, James, had passed 5 years earlier after a long battle with diabetes. Though she missed him every day, she was grateful for their 47 years together and for the close relationships she maintained with her children and grandchildren. She couldn't imagine facing a health crisis like Richard's with only an attorney to call. The bus arrived, and Eleanor boarded, nodding to the evening driver, not Frank, but a younger man who still greeted her as ma'am with genuine respect. As the bus pulled away from the hospital, Eleanor wondered what tomorrow would bring when she returned to visit both her old friend upstairs and her new acquaintance in the cardiac unit. Morning light streamed through the windows of Eleanor's kitchen as she carefully packed 2 containers of her homemade corn muffins, one for Loretta and one for Richard. She wasn't sure if he was allowed solid food yet, but the gesture felt important somehow. Her daughter Yvette called just as Eleanor was putting on her coat. "Morning, Mama, just checking that we're still on for Sunday dinner." "Of course we are," Eleanor replied, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she gathered her purse. "I'm making your father's brisket recipe." Can't wait. The kids are excited to see you. Maya wants to show you her science project." "Looking forward to it, baby. Listen, I'm heading out to the hospital to visit Loretta." "Again? You were just there yesterday." Eleanor hesitated, then decided to share the previous day's events. Yvette listened with growing concern. Mama, you could have been hurt yourself getting involved like that. Nonsense, Eleanor replied. The man needed help, and now you're going back to visit him, a complete stranger. He has no family here, Yvette, no one to look in on him. Her daughter sighed. Your kindness is going to get you in trouble one day. Just be careful, okay? There are a lot of scam artists who prey on people with good hearts, especially little old black ladies. Eleanor finished with a touch of amusement. I may be retired, but I haven't lost my good sense. This man isn't looking to scam anyone. He's just alone and unwell. All right, Mama, I trust your judgment. Just keep your guard up. Always do. I'll see you Sunday. Eleanor hung up, smiling fondly at her daughter's protectiveness. After James died, all three of her children had become more watchful over her, as if age and widowhood had somehow diminished her capabilities rather than enhanced her wisdom. The bus ride to Memorial was quiet this morning. Eleanor used the time to reflect on the strange twist of fate that had placed her in that bathroom at exactly the right moment. Had she not decided to stretch her legs while Loretta napped? Had she not paused at that particular door? The thought sent a small shiver down her spine. At the hospital, Eleanor decided to visit Richard first, reasoning that Loretta would likely still be having her morning treatments. She found her way to room 323, where the door stood slightly ajar. Voices drifted out, Richard's, now stronger than yesterday, and another man's, crisp and professional. Eleanor knocked gently. The conversation inside abruptly ceased. Come in, Richard called. Eleanor entered to find Richard sitting up in bed, looking markedly better than the previous day. His color had improved, and though he was still connected to the temporary pacemaker, he seemed more alert and engaged. Beside the bed stood a thin man in an expensive suit, a leather briefcase at his feet. Eleanor, Richard greeted her, genuine pleasure in his voice. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I said I would, she replied simply, holding up the container of muffins. I brought these, though I'm not sure if you're allowed them yet. A welcome change from hospital fare if the doctor approves, Richard said, then gestured to the man beside him. This is Franklin Pierce, my attorney from Boston. Franklin, this is Eleanor Williams, the lady I told you about, the one who found me. Franklin Pierce extended a manicured hand. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Harrington has explained how instrumental you were in his rescue. We're all very grateful. Eleanor shook his hand, noting the coolness of both his grip and his assessment of her. Anyone would have done the same. I'm not so sure about that, Richard countered. The doctor said most people would have called for help and stepped back. You stayed and kept me stable until the medical team arrived. Franklin checked his watch. I should be going, Richard. I have a meeting with the cardiologist at 10 to discuss the arrangements for your transfer back to Boston. Transfer? Eleanor questioned. So soon. Mr. Harrington is adamant about returning to his own doctors, Franklin explained in a tone that suggested he found the whole situation regrettable. We're arranging medical transport for tomorrow, assuming his condition remains stable. I see, Eleanor said, looking at Richard, who avoided her gaze. We'll talk more this afternoon, Franklin told Richard, picking up his briefcase. Mrs. Williams, a pleasure. After the attorney left, an awkward silence filled the room. Eleanor set the container of muffins on the bedside table. You're determined to return to Boston right away, she finally said, not a question but an observation. Richard sighed. I don't belong here, Eleanor. My life, such as it is in Boston. My doctors know my history. And there's the funeral, Eleanor added gently. For Charles. Richard's expression tightened. Yes, Barbara, his wife, called this morning. The service is next week. I need to be there. Eleanor nodded, understanding his need to say goodbye to his old friend properly. She took a seat in the visitor's chair beside the bed. Tell me about him, she invited. About Charles. Richard seemed surprised by the request, but after a moment his expression softened with memory. Charles Whitley was the finest man I ever knew, he began. Brilliant, but never arrogant about it. Kind, but not weak. He could quote Shakespeare 1 minute and tell the filthiest joke you ever heard the next. Richard smiled at some private recollection. We were as different as two friends could be. He was open, I was reserved. He saw the best in people, I saw the angles, but somehow it worked. The best friendships often involve balance, Eleanor observed. Indeed, though the scales certainly tipped in his favor, Charles was there for me during my darkest moments, after Margaret left. Richard trailed off, his gaze distant. Well, let's just say I didn't handle it with particular grace. Eleanor sensed there was much more to that story, but didn't press. And now he's gone, Richard continued, his voice roughening. The last time I saw him was 6 months ago before the cancer took hold. We had lunch at our old club in Boston. He seemed fine, then complained about his golf game, for God's sake. Then 3 months ago, the diagnosis, pancreatic, stage 4. I'm so sorry, Eleanor said softly. That's a difficult diagnosis. Brutal, Richard agreed. I called every day. Spoke to Barbara when he couldn't come to the phone. I kept promising to visit, but there was always some damn thing, a board meeting, a charity function, meaningless responsibilities that I put ahead of what mattered. His voice cracked slightly. I finally got on a plane yesterday morning and I was still too late. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, offering silent comfort as Richard composed himself. You came, she said simply. You tried. Cold comfort to Charles. Perhaps. But I suspect he knew your heart. Richard gave a humorless laugh. My heart, unreliable to the end. Speaking of which, Eleanor said, shifting the conversation slightly, what did the cardiologist say about your condition? Atrial fibrillation complicated by a complete heart block. They're recommending a permanent pacemaker as soon as possible. Franklin's arranging for the procedure at Mass General next week. Eleanor frowned. That seems risky, delaying the procedure and traveling with a temporary pacemaker. It's my decision, Richard said firmly. Of course it is, Eleanor agreed, recognizing the futility of arguing. Now, would you like to try one of these muffins? I made them myself. The change of subject seemed to relieve Richard. I'd love one, assuming it won't interfere with whatever medications they're pumping into me. Eleanor checked his chart hanging at the foot of the bed, her experienced eyes scanning for dietary restrictions. You're on a regular diet, these should be fine. She opened the container, offering him a still-warm corn muffin. Richard took it with a grateful nod. I haven't had homemade anything in, I can't remember how long, he admitted, taking a bite. His eyebrows rose in appreciation. This is delicious, Eleanor. My mother's recipe. She baked these every Sunday morning before church. You'll have to give me the recipe. Eleanor raised an eyebrow skeptically. Do you cook, Richard? Well, no, he admitted with a small smile, but my housekeeper might appreciate it. The mention of a housekeeper reminded Eleanor of the vast differences in their lives, Richard with his Boston mansion and household staff, she in her modest home in a historically black neighborhood, carefully budgeting her nurse's pension. I should go up and see Loretta, Eleanor said, rising from her chair. She'll be wondering where I am. Your friend with cancer, Richard remembered. How is she doing? Fighting, Eleanor replied. It's her third round of chemotherapy. Richard nodded solemnly. I hope it goes better for her than it did for Charles. The treatment seemed to take more from him than the disease itself at the end. I'll come back before I leave if you'd like, Eleanor offered. I'd like that very much, Richard replied, a hint of vulnerability beneath his composed exterior. Eleanor made her way to the oncology floor, finding Loretta awake and in better spirits than the previous day. There she is, Loretta greeted her. My guardian angel saving lives all over the hospital. Word travels fast, Eleanor noted, setting down the second container of muffins. Diane told me all about your heroics with that Boston bigwig, said if you hadn't found him when you did, he might not have made it. Just happened to be in the right place. Hum, Loretta hummed knowingly. The Lord puts us where we need to be, Ellie, you know that. Eleanor smiled at her friend's unwavering faith. How are you feeling today? Better than yesterday. The nausea's not so bad. Loretta reached eagerly for a muffin. You spoil me, you know that? That's what friends do. They chatted comfortably for an hour, Loretta sharing gossip about her children and grandchildren, Eleanor recounting Maya's latest achievements. Neither woman mentioned Loretta's cancer directly, a tacit agreement to focus on life rather than illness during their visits. Eventually, Loretta's son arrived, a tall man in his 40s who greeted Eleanor with a warm hug. Miss Ellie looking as beautiful as ever. Shameless flatterer, just like your father, Eleanor replied with affection. To Loretta, she added, I'll let you two visit, I'll be back tomorrow. Going to check on your patient downstairs? Loretta teased. Not my patient, Eleanor corrected. Just a man who could use some kindness. Loretta's expression grew serious. Be careful with that one, Ellie. Men like that aren't used to kindness without strings. What do you mean? Rich white men from Boston, they don't know what to make of people who give without expecting something in return, makes them suspicious. Loretta paused, then added, just guard your heart, that's all I'm saying. Eleanor squeezed her friend's hand. My heart's not at risk, Loretta. I'm just being neighborly. Returning to the cardiac unit, Eleanor found Richard's room empty except for a young nurse changing the bed linens. Excuse me, Eleanor said. I'm looking for Mr. Harrington. They took him down for tests about 20 minutes ago, the nurse replied. Echocardiogram and some other imaging, he should be back within the hour. I see, thank you. Disappointed, but understanding the necessity of medical procedures, Eleanor decided to leave. She wrote a brief note on hospital stationery. Richard, sorry I missed you. Wishing you safe travels back to Boston and a successful procedure. Take care, Eleanor Williams. She left it with the corn muffins on his bedside table. As she turned to go, something caught her eye, a leather-bound book tucked partially under the pillow. Without thinking, Eleanor straightened the bedding, moving the book to the nightstand. As she did, it fell open, revealing a photograph tucked between the pages. Eleanor couldn't help but glance at the image, a much younger Richard standing beside a striking woman with dark hair and bright eyes. They were on a beach somewhere, both laughing, the woman's arm looped through Richard's. Even in the faded photograph, the happiness between them was palpable. Eleanor quickly closed the book, feeling as though she had intruded on something private. She placed it carefully on the nightstand and left, troubled by the glimpse into Richard's past and the evident loss it represented. On the bus ride home, Eleanor found herself thinking about the photograph and the woman who must have been Margaret. What had happened between them? What could end a marriage that had once contained such evident joy? Eleanor's own marriage to James had weathered many storms, financial hardships, the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, raising 3 children in a world that often seemed determined to limit their opportunities. There had been arguments, tears, occasional silences that stretched for days. But they had always found their way back to each other, the foundation of their love strong enough to withstand the pressures placed upon it. What pressure, she wondered, had broken the bond between Richard and Margaret? And why, after 30 years, did he still carry her photograph? The following morning, Eleanor debated whether to return to the hospital. Richard would likely be gone already, transported back to Boston where his life and his medical team awaited. Yet something compelled her to make the trip, perhaps simply to check on Loretta, or perhaps to satisfy her curiosity about the man whose life had briefly intersected with hers. To her surprise, when she arrived at room 323, Richard was still there, sitting on the edge of the bed in a robe while a nurse checked his temporary pacemaker. "Eleanor," he said, clearly pleased to see her. "I thought I'd missed the chance to say goodbye." "I expected you'd be gone by now," she admitted, remaining in the doorway until the nurse finished her work. "Slight change of plans," Richard explained as the nurse departed. "There was a complication with the air ambulance. We're now scheduled to leave this afternoon." Eleanor approached the bed, noticing the untouched container of muffins and her note on the nightstand. "I see you found my note." "Yes, thank you, and for the muffins. I saved them for breakfast this morning." An awkward silence fell between them, the peculiar discomfort of near strangers who have shared an intense experience. "How are you feeling today?" Eleanor asked. "Better, still not quite myself, but better." Eleanor nodded, unsure what else to say. She had come to say goodbye to a man she barely knew, yet who seemed important in some indefinable way. Richard cleared his throat. "I want to thank you properly, Eleanor, for what you did. The doctor was quite clear that your quick action and medical knowledge likely saved my life." "As I said before, anyone would have—" "No," Richard interrupted firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have called for help and stepped back. You stayed, you knew what to do, you held my hand when I was afraid." His voice softened. "That matters." Eleanor accepted his gratitude with a small nod. "You're welcome, Richard." "I'd like to show my appreciation in a more tangible way," he continued, reaching for a checkbook on the nightstand. "I know you're retired, and I thought perhaps—" "No," Eleanor said more sharply than she intended. "I don't want your money, Richard." He looked startled, then embarrassed. "I didn't mean to offend." "Not everything has a price tag," Eleanor said, gentling her tone. "Some things we do simply because they're right." Richard set the checkbook aside, studying her with new interest. "You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor Williams. Not remarkable, just shaped by different experiences than yours, perhaps." Richard seemed about to respond when a knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Patterson. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington. Mrs. Williams, nice to see you again." The young doctor approached the bed, chart in hand. "I have your discharge paperwork and instructions for the transfer team. We'll need to go over a few things before you leave." "I should go," Eleanor said, stepping back. "I need to visit Loretta upstairs." "Wait," Richard said, surprising both her and the doctor with the urgency in his voice. "Eleanor, would you come back before I leave? The transport is scheduled for 2 o'clock. I'd like to say a proper goodbye." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try to make it back by then." As she turned to go, Richard called after her. "Eleanor, thank you for everything." Eleanor found Loretta in good spirits, sitting up in a chair by the window as a nurse changed her sheets. "Look at you out of bed," Eleanor observed approvingly. "Doctor says I need to keep my strength up," Loretta replied. "How's your Boston gentleman?" "Leaving this afternoon," Eleanor said, unpacking the fresh muffins she had brought. "Going back to his own doctor's for the pacemaker procedure." Loretta hummed noncommittally. "Probably for the best, gets things back to normal." Eleanor didn't respond, unsure herself why she felt a strange reluctance about Richard's departure. They were strangers, after all, connected only by chance and circumstance. "You look troubled, Ellie," Loretta observed once the nurse had left. "What's on your mind?" Eleanor sighed, settling into the visitor's chair. I'm not sure. There's something about this man, something unresolved. Like what? I don't know exactly. Yesterday I saw a photograph in his room, him with a woman who must have been his ex-wife, Margaret. They looked so happy, yet they've been divorced for 30 years and he still carries her picture. Some wounds never fully heal, Loretta said softly. I suppose not. Eleanor paused, then added, he tried to give me money this morning, as a thank you for saving his life. Loretta snorted. Told you, men like that think everything has a price. I don't think he meant it that way, Eleanor defended, surprising herself. I think he simply doesn't know how else to express gratitude. Maybe so, Loretta conceded. What did you tell him? That not everything has a price tag, that some things we do simply because they're right. Loretta smiled. Amen to that. You teach him something important, Ellie. Before Eleanor could respond, a nurse appeared at the door. Mrs. Williams, there's a call for you at the nurse's station. A Mr. Franklin Pierce. Eleanor exchanged a puzzled glance with Loretta before following the nurse to the station. She picked up the phone with trepidation. This is Eleanor Williams. Mrs. Williams, Franklin Pierce here. I apologize for tracking you down, but there's been a situation with Richard. Eleanor's grip tightened on the receiver. What kind of situation? He's refusing to leave. He was fine until the transport team arrived, then he became agitated. He's demanding to speak with you before he goes anywhere. The doctors are concerned about his heart rate and blood pressure. I told him I'd come say goodbye before he left, Eleanor said, guilt washing over her. His transport wasn't scheduled until 2. There was an earlier opening. We tried to move things up. Franklin's professional tone cracked slightly. Mrs. Williams, I've never seen Richard like this. He's not a man given to emotional displays. I'll come right down, Eleanor promised, already moving toward the elevator. When she reached room 323, she found it in chaos. Richard was sitting rigidly on the edge of the bed, still in his hospital gown, his face flushed with anger or exertion. Dr. Patterson stood nearby, along with Franklin and 2 paramedics in uniform. I said I'm not going anywhere until I speak with Eleanor, Richard was saying as she entered, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. I'm here, Richard, Eleanor announced, drawing all eyes to her. What's going on? The relief on Richard's face was palpable. Eleanor, thank God, Dr. Patterson approached her. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Harrington became quite upset when the transport team arrived. His heart rate and blood pressure are elevated to concerning levels. He's refusing to be transferred until he speaks with you. Eleanor moved to Richard's bedside, acutely aware of all the eyes on them. Richard, you need to stay calm. Your heart, to hell with my heart, he interrupted. It's never done me any good anyway. Eleanor took his hand firmly in hers. Richard Harrington, you stop this right now. You're putting yourself at risk. Something in her tone, perhaps the authoritative nurse she had once been, seemed to reach him. His breathing slowed, and he nodded. Could everyone give us a moment, please? Eleanor asked, looking around the room. Dr. Patterson hesitated. Vitals, I'll call immediately if there's any change, she promised. Reluctantly, the others filed out, Franklin casting a worried glance back at his client before closing the door. Alone with Richard, Eleanor sat beside him on the bed. Now, what is this all about? Richard took a deep breath. I don't know how to say this without sounding like a fool. Just say it, Eleanor encouraged. I'm afraid, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. I'm afraid to go back to Boston. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. When I woke up yesterday after they placed the temporary pacemaker, I had this moment of clarity, Richard continued. I saw my life for what it is, empty rooms in a too large house, business associates rather than friends, a calendar full of meaningless obligations. He looked down at their joined hands. Charles was my last real connection to anything that mattered. What about Margaret? Eleanor asked gently. Richard's head snapped up. How do you know about Margaret? You called her name in the bathroom when you first regained consciousness, and Dr. Patterson mentioned they were trying to contact her. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Margaret left me in 1963. She had every reason to. I was not a good husband, too focused on my career, too rigid in my expectations, too blind to what was important. The words seemed to flow easier now, as if a dam had broken. I fought the divorce bitterly, more out of pride than love, I think. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. She had remarried, moved to California. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, and meant it. The crueler truth, I never remarried, never even came close, threw myself into making money, serving on boards, building the perfect life on paper. Richard gave a bitter laugh. And now here I am, 75 years old, with a failing heart and not a single person in the world who would miss me if I died in this hospital bed. That can't be true, Eleanor protested. It is. Franklin would handle my estate efficiently. The charities that receive my donations would find other wealthy patrons. The world would continue spinning without so much as a hiccup. Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond to such bleak assessment. And this realization is why you're afraid to go back. When I go back, nothing will change, Richard said simply. I'll have the pacemaker surgery, I'll recover in my empty house, I'll return to my meaningless obligations, and one day, hopefully many years from now, I'll die alone, having learned nothing from this second chance. Eleanor sat with this for a moment, understanding washing over her. So what do you want to do instead? I don't know, Richard admitted. All I know is that when they came to take me away, all I could think was that I needed to talk to you one more time, that somehow you would understand. The weight of his words hung between them, the desperate reach of a drowning man toward the only lifeline he could see. Richard, Eleanor began carefully, I'm honored by your trust, but I'm just a stranger who happened to find you in time. You're the first person in years who has shown me kindness without wanting something in return, Richard countered. The first person who has made me feel human, not Richard Harrington of Harrington Investments, not a name on a donor wall, not a client or a board member or a checkbook, just a man. Eleanor felt the truth in his words and the enormous responsibility they placed on her shoulders. This man was at a crossroads, and somehow, inexplicably, she had become part of his journey. What about Charles's funeral? She asked. You said you needed to be there. It's next Wednesday. I could still go even if I stayed here for the pacemaker surgery. Eleanor considered this. And your doctors in Boston, surely they know your medical history better than the team here. My medical records can be transferred. Dr. Patterson already offered that as an option, but Franklin was insistent about getting me back to Boston. Because that's what he thinks is best for you, Eleanor pointed out. What's best for me, Richard said with sudden conviction, is to stop running from the truth about my life, to face what I've become and find the courage to change it, even at this late hour. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the wealthy businessman or the difficult patient, but a man confronting his mortality and the emptiness of the life he had built. If you stay, she said slowly, what would you do differently? I don't know yet, Richard admitted, but I know I want to find out. And he hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. I'd like to get to know you better, Eleanor Williams, not because you saved my life, but because in our brief acquaintance you've shown me more about genuine humanity than I've experienced in decades. Eleanor felt a flutter of alarm. Richard, if you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, he assured her quickly. I'm simply acknowledging that meeting you has affected me profoundly. That perhaps there's something I'm meant to learn from our chance encounter. Eleanor considered his words, weighing them against her own instincts. There was sincerity in his eyes and a vulnerability that belied his usual commanding presence. I need to get the others, she finally said. Dr. Patterson needs to check your vitals and Franklin needs to be part of this conversation. If you're serious about staying, there are practical matters to consider. Richard nodded, releasing her hand. Of course. You're right, Eleanor stood, straightening her skirt. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I think there's wisdom in listening to these moments of clarity when they come. They don't happen often in life. Thank you, Eleanor. She opened the door, finding Dr. Patterson, Franklin, and the transport team waiting anxiously in the hallway. Mrs. Williams, Dr. Patterson questioned. Is everything all right? Mr. Harrington would like to discuss changing his plans, Eleanor explained calmly. He's considering having the pacemaker procedure here rather than returning to Boston immediately. Franklin's expression tightened. That's out of the question. The arrangements have all been made. His cardiologist is expecting him. I believe that's Mr. Harrington's decision, Eleanor said firmly. Dr. Patterson intervened diplomatically. Why don't we all go in and discuss this calmly? Mr. Harrington's health is our primary concern. What followed was a tense but civil negotiation. Richard, calmer now but no less determined, explained his desire to remain in Memphis for the procedure. Dr. Patterson outlined the medical options, assuring Richard that they could provide excellent care and coordinate with his Boston doctors. Franklin raised numerous practical objections, from Richard's lack of clothing and personal items to the disruption of his business affairs. Throughout, Eleanor remained silent, feeling somewhat out of place in this discussion between professionals and their client. Yet whenever the tension rose, Richard would glance at her, seeming to draw strength from her presence. Finally, a compromise was reached. Richard would stay for the pacemaker procedure, scheduled for the following morning. Franklin would return to Boston to gather necessary items and handle urgent business matters, then come back for Charles's funeral, which Richard was determined to attend. And what about after the funeral? Franklin asked, his frustration evident. Are you planning to relocate permanently to Memphis, Richard? I haven't decided anything beyond the immediate future, Richard replied evenly. One step at a time, Franklin. With the decision made, the transport team departed. Dr. Patterson went to make the arrangements for the procedure, leaving Eleanor, Richard, and Franklin alone in the room. Mrs. Williams, Franklin said, his tone carefully controlled, might I have a word with you in private? Eleanor glanced at Richard, who nodded slightly. Of course. She followed Franklin into the hallway, bracing herself for whatever the attorney might say. Mrs. Williams, Franklin began once they were out of earshot, I want to be direct with you. I've known Richard Harrington for 25 years. He is not a man given to impulsive decisions or emotional attachments. This behavior is completely out of character. People sometimes change when confronted with their mortality, Eleanor observed. Indeed. Franklin studied her intently. May I ask what your interest is in all this? What do you hope to gain from your involvement with my client? The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt a flash of indignation. I have no interest beyond Mr. Harrington's well-being, Mr. Pierce. I found a fellow human being in distress, and I helped him. That's the beginning and end of my involvement. You must understand my concern, Franklin persisted. Richard is vulnerable right now, grieving his oldest friend, facing serious health issues. He's also a very wealthy man. I'm well aware of the difference in our circumstances, Eleanor said coldly. If you're suggesting I have designs on Mr. Harrington's money, you're sorely mistaken. In fact, he offered me a check this morning, which I refused. This seemed to give Franklin pause. He did? Yes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on my friend upstairs. Eleanor turned to go, then stopped, facing Franklin once more. Mr. Pierce, has it occurred to you that perhaps Richard needs something money can't buy? Connection, purpose, a chance to reassess his life. Franklin's expression softened slightly. I've been concerned about Richard's isolation for years, Mrs. Williams. I've encouraged him to reconnect with family, to build relationships. He's always resisted. Until now, Eleanor pointed out. Till now, Franklin agreed, a note of reluctant respect entering his voice. Perhaps nearly dying has accomplished what years of my advice could not. Eleanor nodded. I should go back and say goodbye before I leave. I won't be returning until tomorrow. Of course. When Eleanor re-entered the room, Richard was sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the hospital grounds below. Everything all right with Franklin? He asked without turning. He's concerned about you, Eleanor replied diplomatically. He thinks you're after my money, Richard said bluntly, turning to face her. I set him straight. I appreciate that. Eleanor gathered her purse. I should go check on Loretta. She'll be wondering what happened to me. Will you come tomorrow after the procedure? Yes, Eleanor promised. But Richard, you need to be clear about what you're doing here, what you're hoping for. Richard considered this. Clarity is what I'm seeking, Eleanor. I don't have all the answers yet. I just know I'm not ready to return to my old life as if nothing has changed. Eleanor nodded, understanding. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a big day. As she turned to leave, Richard called after her once more. Eleanor, thank you for not giving up on me in the bathroom or today. Rest, Richard, she repeated gently. I'll see you tomorrow. Upstairs, Loretta was full of questions about the drama that had unfolded. So he's staying, she asked incredulously. Because of you. Not because of me, Eleanor insisted. Because he's having a moment of reckoning with his life. I just happened to be there when it happened. Hum, Loretta hummed skeptically. And what exactly does he want from you, Ellie? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. Friendship, perhaps, a connection to something real in a life that seems to have been lacking in substance. And what do you want? The question caught Eleanor off guard. I don't want anything. I'm simply helping someone in need. The way you'd help anyone, Loretta said, not quite a question. Yes, Eleanor replied, though she found herself wondering if that was entirely true. There was something about Richard Harrington that had captured her interest, his vulnerability beneath the polished exterior, the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his ex-wife, the courage it took for him to admit the emptiness of his life. Just be careful, Loretta advised. Men like that aren't used to hearing no. Richard isn't like that. Eleanor found herself defending him. He's complicated. Aren't we all? Loretta murmured. The day of Richard's procedure dawned clear and cool. Eleanor arrived at the hospital early, stopping to buy a small plant in the gift shop, a peace lily in a simple ceramic pot. It seemed a more appropriate gift than flowers for a man facing surgery. She found Richard's room empty, his bed already gone. A nurse at the station informed her that he had been taken to pre-op an hour earlier. The procedure should take about 2 hours, the nurse explained. Then he'll be in recovery for another hour before returning to his room. You're welcome to wait, but it might be a while. Eleanor decided to visit Loretta first, finding her friend dozing lightly in her room. Rather than wake her, Eleanor left a note with the day's corn muffins and headed to the surgical waiting area. The waiting room was nearly empty at this early hour. Eleanor settled into a chair with a tattered magazine, preparing for a long wait. To her surprise, she spotted Franklin Pierce at the far end of the room, his attention focused on a stack of legal documents. He looked up as she approached. "Mrs. Williams, good morning." "Mr. Pierce, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you were returning to Boston." "My flight isn't until this evening," Franklin replied, gesturing to the chair beside him. "I wanted to be here for the procedure in case there were decisions to be made." Eleanor sat, setting the piece lily on the table between them. "That's very thoughtful." Franklin's expression softened slightly. "Despite what you might think, Mrs. Williams, I do care about Richard. We've worked together for many years." "I never doubted that," Eleanor assured him. "You were right to question my involvement. You're protecting your client." "And friend," Franklin added quietly. Though Richard would likely scoff at the sentiment. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes before Franklin spoke again. "I owe you an apology for my assumptions yesterday. Richard told me how you refused his check. That's unusual in my experience." "Some things can't be repaid with money," Eleanor said simply. Franklin studied her with newfound respect. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Williams? Why did you stay with him?" "In that bathroom, when most people would have called for help and stepped back. Why did you stay?" Eleanor considered the question. 30 years as a nurse, I suppose. You develop certain instincts, certain reflexes, but more than that." She paused, searching for the right words. "No one should be alone in their most vulnerable moments. We all deserve a hand to hold when we're afraid." Franklin nodded slowly. "A simple human truth that's easy to forget in my world." He gestured to the legal documents beside him. "When everything becomes a transaction, a contract, a negotiation." "What was he like?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Before, when you first met him?" Franklin seemed surprised by the question but considered it thoughtfully. "Formidable, brilliant in business, demanding of others but more demanding of himself. Always reserved even then, but there was a spark, a passion for building something meaningful." He sighed. "Over the years, that spark dimmed. Especially after Charles's wife called 5 months ago to say the cancer had returned. Richard withdrew even further. They were close, he and Charles. Like brothers, Franklin confirmed. Charles was the only person who could make Richard laugh genuinely, the only one who could challenge him without repercussion. "And Margaret," Eleanor ventured. "His ex-wife," Franklin's expression turned cautious. "That's a complex history, Mrs. Williams, not my place to share. Of course, I apologize for prying." "No need to apologize, it's natural to be curious." Franklin hesitated, then added, "I will say this, Richard never truly recovered from losing her. Whatever mistakes he made, and they were significant, he has paid for them with 30 years of solitude." Before Eleanor could respond, a surgeon in scrubs appeared at the waiting room entrance. "Family of Richard Harrington." Franklin rose quickly, Eleanor following. "I'm his attorney, Franklin Pierce. This is Eleanor Williams, a friend." The surgeon approached them. "The procedure went well. We successfully implanted the permanent pacemaker. Mr. Harrington is in recovery now, still under sedation, but stable. Barring complications, he should be able to return to his room within the hour." "Thank you, doctor," Franklin said, relief evident in his voice. "When can we see him?" Eleanor asked. "Once he's back in his room, a nurse will come get you." As the surgeon departed, Franklin turned to Eleanor. "I have some calls to make. Would you mind staying, in case he wakes earlier than expected?" "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "Thank you." Franklin gathered his documents. "For everything." Left alone in the waiting room, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought her into Richard Harrington's life. Had she not decided to visit Loretta that day, had she not paused at that particular bathroom door? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Was it merely chance, as she had always believed? Or was Loretta right? Did the Lord place people where they needed to be? Eleanor had never been as certain in her faith as her friend, yet she couldn't deny the sense of purpose she felt in having found Richard when she did. After nearly 2 hours, a nurse appeared. "Mrs. Williams, Mr. Harrington is back in his room now. He's asking for you." Eleanor followed the nurse to the familiar room 323, where Richard lay propped against pillows, looking pale but alert. A bulge beneath his hospital gown indicated the site of the newly implanted pacemaker. "Eleanor," he greeted her, his voice rough from the intubation during surgery. "You came." "I said I would," she replied, setting the piece lily on his nightstand. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Richard admitted with a small smile, "but they tell me everything went well." The surgeon seemed pleased. Eleanor took the chair beside his bed. "Franklin was here earlier. He had some calls to make." Richard nodded, then gestured to the plant. "Thank you for this, much better than flowers." "I thought it might last longer," Eleanor explained. "Peace lilies are hardy, hard to kill even for those without a green thumb." "Are you calling me plant-challenged, Eleanor?" Richard asked with mock offense. Just making an educated guess about a man who likely has a staff to handle such matters. Richard laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his incision site. Accurate. Though I do have a small garden at my summer house on Cape Cod. Nothing elaborate, just a few tomato plants and herbs. Margaret started it years ago. I've kept it up in my fashion. The mention of his ex-wife hung in the air between them. You still miss her, Eleanor observed gently. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he finally admitted, though miss seems an inadequate word for 30 years of regret. What happened? Eleanor asked, then quickly added, if you don't mind my asking. Richard sighed, his gaze distant. The usual story, I suppose. Young man marries beautiful woman, promises her the world, then gets so caught up in creating that world that he forgets why he wanted it in the first place. He shifted against the pillows. I was building an empire, or so I thought. Long hours, missed dinners, canceled vacations. Margaret was patient until she wasn't. She wanted children? Eleanor guessed. Yes. I kept saying not yet, not until the business is established. Until one day the biological clock ran out. She was 40 when she finally left. Too late to start over with someone else, at least in terms of having children. Richard's expression tightened with remembered pain. She said she could forgive the neglect, the broken promises, even my affair with my secretary, the most cliched mistake a man can make. But she couldn't forgive me for the children she never had. Eleanor felt a wave of sympathy for both of them, for Margaret and her unfulfilled longing for motherhood, for Richard and his belated recognition of what he had sacrificed. Did she ever remarry? Eleanor asked. Yes, about 5 years later, a professor at Berkeley. No children, but from what Charles told me, they seemed happy. Richard attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She deserved that, at least. And you? Why did you never remarry? Richard considered the question. I told myself I was too busy, too focused on the business, the truth. He met Eleanor's gaze directly. I didn't deserve another chance, not after what I'd done. The raw honesty of his answer caught Eleanor off guard. Before she could respond, Franklin returned, his briefcase in hand. Richard, good to see you awake. How are you feeling? Like I've been thoroughly reminded of my mortality, Richard replied dryly. Franklin smiled. Well, you look better than you did yesterday. The doctor says the procedure was textbook perfect. Small mercies. Richard gestured to the chair on the other side of his bed. Sit, Franklin, you look like you have news. Franklin settled into the chair, opening his briefcase. I've arranged everything in Boston. Your housekeeper will pack what you need and ship it here. I've postponed your board meetings and committee obligations for the next 2 weeks. And I've spoken with Barbara about Charles's funeral. She's expecting us both on Wednesday. Richard nodded gratefully. Thank you, Franklin, always efficient. There is one other matter, Franklin continued, glancing briefly at Eleanor. Margaret called the office this morning. Richard's entire body tensed. Margaret, why? Apparently someone from the hospital called her when you were first admitted. She's been trying to reach you. She was concerned. After 30 years, Richard murmured, disbelief evident in his voice. She asked for your number here. I took the liberty of giving it to her. I hope that was all right. Richard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Yes, that's fine. An awkward silence fell over the room. Eleanor rose from her chair, sensing the need to give Richard privacy. I should check on Loretta, she said. I'll come back later if you'd like. Richard seemed to pull himself from a deep well of thought. Yes, please do, and Eleanor, thank you for being here. As she left the room, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder what this new development might mean for Richard and for the tentative connection forming between them. Upstairs, Loretta was sitting up in a chair by the window, looking through old photographs. She brightened when Eleanor entered. There you are. I was beginning to think you'd forgot me for your Boston gentleman. Never, Eleanor assured her, taking the chair opposite. His procedure went well. He's resting now. And how are you feeling about all this? Loretta asked perceptively. This unexpected detour in your orderly life. Eleanor considered the question. Confused, I suppose. I went to visit you and somehow ended up involved in a stranger's life crisis. Not such a stranger anymore, though, is he? No, Eleanor admitted. Not a stranger, but I don't know what to call him. An acquaintance, a friend. It's all happened so quickly. Loretta studied her thoughtfully. You're drawn to him. Not romantically, Eleanor clarified quickly. But there's something. I feel like I'm meant to help him somehow, to be part of whatever transformation he's going through. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Loretta said with a knowing smile. Sometimes he puts people in our path for reasons we don't immediately understand. His ex-wife called, Eleanor said, changing the subject slightly. After 30 years of silence, Loretta raised her eyebrows. Now that's interesting. The plot thickens. Indeed. They spent the next hour looking through Loretta's photographs, memories of church picnics, family gatherings, and their younger selves marching for civil rights in the 1960s. It was a welcome distraction from the complicated emotions Eleanor was feeling about Richard's situation. Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned to room 323, finding Richard alone and awake, staring at the telephone on his nightstand as if it might bite him. "She hasn't called yet," he said without preamble as Eleanor entered. "Margaret?" Richard nodded. "Franklin said she might call today. I've been sitting here like a nervous schoolboy waiting." Eleanor took her usual chair. "What will you say to her if she does call?" "I have no idea," Richard admitted. 30 years of silence and now this, it feels. He searched for the right word. "Momentous," Eleanor suggested. "Yes, momentous, as if the universe is sending me a message." "Or just a concerned ex-wife checking on your welfare," Eleanor said pragmatically. Richard smiled. "Always keeping me grounded, aren't you, Eleanor?" "Someone has to." They fell into comfortable conversation about safer topics. Eleanor's grandchildren, Richard's garden at Cape Cod, books they had both enjoyed. There was an ease between them now that surprised Eleanor, given their vastly different backgrounds and the brief duration of their acquaintance. As visiting hours drew to a close, Eleanor prepared to leave. "I should go, you need your rest." "Will you come tomorrow?" Richard asked, that same vulnerability creeping into his voice. "Yes, though it will be later. I'm having Sunday dinner with my family." "Tell me about them," Richard requested. "Your family." Eleanor settled back into her chair, speaking with pride about her 3 children, Yvette the professor, Michael the attorney, and David the physician, and her 5 grandchildren, each with their own distinct personality and talents. "They sound wonderful," Richard said when she finished. "You must be very proud." "They are my greatest joy," Eleanor agreed. "My greatest accomplishment." "You've lived a rich life, Eleanor Williams." "Not rich in the way the world measures such things," she replied. "But rich in what matters, yes." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That's the wisdom I need to learn even at this late hour." As Eleanor rose to leave, the telephone rang. Richard's hand shot out to answer it, then hesitated, trembling slightly. "Would you like me to step out?" Eleanor asked. Richard shook his head. "Stay, please." He lifted the receiver. "Hello." Eleanor watched as his expression transformed shock, then a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't fully decipher. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it's me." Eleanor moved toward the door, giving him privacy despite his request for her to stay. Richard's eyes followed her, silently pleading, and she nodded reassuringly, "I'll be right outside." In the hallway, Eleanor leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the moment. Whatever was transpiring in that room between Richard and his ex-wife represented 30 years of unfinished business, of paths not taken, of regrets carried like stones in a pocket. After about 20 minutes, the door opened. Richard stood there in his robe, looking both exhausted and somehow lighter. "Eleanor," he said softly, "would you come back in?" She followed him inside, where he carefully lowered himself back onto the bed. "How was it?" she asked gently. "Strange, painful, necessary." Richard took a deep breath. "She's coming to Charles's funeral. She and Barbara remained friends all these years, though I didn't know, she said." His voice caught. "She said she's forgiven me long ago." "That's a gift," Eleanor observed. "One I'm not sure I deserve." "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," Eleanor said. "It's about healing for both parties." Richard nodded slowly. "She asked about you. I told her how you found me, how you've been a friend these past few days." The word friend hung between them, testing its fit. "I should really go now," Eleanor said. "It's getting late." "Of course, thank you for staying." At the door, Eleanor paused. "Richard, I'm glad she called. Everyone deserves the chance to make peace with their past. Even a foolish old man who wasted too many years on the wrong priorities." "Especially him," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. The weekend passed in a blur of family obligations and hospital visits. Eleanor divided her time between Loretta, whose treatments were progressing well, and Richard, who was recovering steadily from his procedure. By Monday, he was walking the halls of the cardiac unit, regaining his strength for the journey to Boston for Charles's funeral. Franklin had returned to Boston but called daily, keeping Richard updated on business matters and funeral arrangements. Richard listened patiently to these reports, but showed little interest in the business concerns that had once consumed him. Instead, he asked Eleanor endless questions about her life, about raising children during the civil rights movement, about her nursing career, about the changes she had witnessed in Memphis over the decades. He listened with genuine interest to her stories, occasionally sharing his own, though he spoke little of his business achievements and more of the personal moments sailing with Charles, holidays at Cape Cod, the garden Margaret had started. On Tuesday afternoon, the day before Richard was scheduled to fly to Boston for the funeral, Eleanor arrived to find him sitting in the chair by the window. Fully dressed in clothes Franklin had sent from Boston, a casual sweater and slacks that made him look more approachable than his previous suit. "Look at you," Eleanor said approvingly. "Almost ready to rejoin the world." "Almost," Richard agreed. "The doctor says I can be discharged tomorrow morning, just in time to catch the flight Franklin arranged." "How are you feeling about going back?" Eleanor asked, taking her usual seat. "Nervous," Richard admitted, "about seeing Margaret at the funeral, about being in Boston again after everything that's happened." He looked at her intently. "I feel like a different person than the man who arrived here a week ago." "Near-death experiences have that effect," Eleanor observed. "It's more than that." Richard leaned forward. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about what happens after the funeral. About what I want the rest of my life to look like." Eleanor waited, sensing he needed to articulate these thoughts without interruption. "I've decided to step down from active management of my company," Richard continued, "to hand over the reins to younger executives who have the energy and vision for it. I want to use my resources differently, to establish a foundation, perhaps, focused on healthcare accessibility." "That sounds meaningful," Eleanor encouraged. "I'd like your input," Richard said, surprising her. "Your perspective as someone who's worked on the front lines of healthcare, as someone who understands what really matters." Eleanor was touched by his request, but cautious. "I'd be happy to share my thoughts, Richard, but these are decisions you need to make for yourself." "I know, but I value your wisdom." He hesitated, then added, "I was hoping you might consider visiting Boston once things have settled. I could show you the foundation plans as they develop, perhaps introduce you to some people who could help implement them." The invitation caught Eleanor off guard. "Boston? Just for a visit," Richard clarified quickly. "Franklin could arrange everything: first-class tickets, a suite at the Four Seasons." Eleanor held up a hand, stopping him. "Richard, I appreciate the invitation, but if I were to visit Boston, I wouldn't need first-class tickets or luxury hotels. That's not who I am." Richard looked chagrined. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend." "You didn't," Eleanor assured him. "But I think we need to be clear about something. We come from very different worlds, Richard. Worlds that don't often intersect except in the way they have here by chance in a hospital where external trappings fall away." "And you think those differences matter too much?" Richard asked, a note of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "I think they matter exactly as much as we allow them to," Eleanor replied carefully. "But I also think it's important to acknowledge them, to be realistic about what kind of friendship is possible between us." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "You're right, of course. I apologize for presuming." "There's nothing to apologize for," Eleanor said gently. "Let's focus on the present. You have a funeral to attend tomorrow, a friend to honor, and an ex-wife to face after 30 years. That's quite enough to handle for now." Richard nodded, accepting her redirection of the conversation. "Will you come see me before I leave tomorrow? My flight isn't until noon." "Of course." As Eleanor prepared to leave, Richard called after her. "Eleanor, thank you for your honesty. It's a rare gift in my world." The following morning, Eleanor arrived at the hospital to find Richard sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed in a dark suit, his packed suitcase beside him. Looked like his old self again, composed, dignified, a man accustomed to power and authority. Yet there was a new softness around his eyes, a humility in his bearing that hadn't been there before. "All ready to go, I see," Eleanor observed. "Just waiting for the discharge paperwork," Richard confirmed. "And for you." Eleanor sat beside him on the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Physically, much better. The pacemaker is doing its job." Richard touched his chest lightly. "Emotionally, that's more complicated." "I can imagine." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Richard spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about our different worlds." "Richard, please let me finish," he requested gently. "You were right. We do come from different worlds, worlds shaped by different privileges, different challenges, different perspectives. I won't pretend to understand what your life has been like, Eleanor. But I do know this: meeting you has changed me. And not just because you saved my life in that bathroom." Eleanor listened, moved by his sincerity. "You showed me what real dignity looks like," Richard continued. "What strength and wisdom look like when they're earned through meaningful work and genuine connection, not through wealth or position. And for that lesson alone, I will always be grateful." "You give me too much credit," Eleanor demurred. "I don't think I do," Richard countered. "But regardless, I want you to have this." He reached into his suit pocket and withdrew a small envelope, offering it to her. Eleanor took it hesitantly. "Richard, I told you I don't want your money." "It's not a check," he assured her. "Open it." Inside the envelope, Eleanor found a business card. On the back, written in precise handwriting, was a telephone number. "My private line," Richard explained. Not the one that goes through secretaries and assistants, the one that rings directly to me. If you ever need anything at all, I want you to call that number. Eleanor looked at the card, understanding the significance of the gesture. Thank you. And this, Richard added, handing her a second envelope, is for Loretta, a small contribution to help with her medical expenses. I've already arranged it with the hospital billing department. She won't have to worry about the cost of her treatments. Eleanor's eyes widened. Richard, that's extremely generous. It's the least I can do, he said simply, for the friend of the woman who saved my life. Before Eleanor could respond, a nurse arrived with Richard's discharge paperwork. As he reviewed and signed the forms, a hospital orderly appeared with a wheelchair, standard protocol for discharging patients. I don't need that, Richard protested. I can walk perfectly well. Hospital policy, sir, the orderly explained patiently. Richard looked at Eleanor, who raised an eyebrow in silent challenge. With a sigh of resignation, Richard sat in the wheelchair. One last lesson in humility, he murmured as the orderly began wheeling him toward the elevator. Eleanor walked alongside them, carrying Richard's small suitcase. As they reached the hospital entrance, a sleek black car waited at the curb. My ride to the airport, Richard explained unnecessarily. The driver, seeing their approach, hurried to open the rear door. The orderly helped Richard from the wheelchair to the car, while Eleanor handed the suitcase to the driver. Before getting into the car, Richard turned to Eleanor, taking both her hands in his. I don't know how to say goodbye to someone who has given me a second chance at life, he said softly. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. Then don't say goodbye, Eleanor suggested. Say until we meet again. Richard smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face. Until we meet again, Eleanor Williams. He leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek, then stepped back, squeezing her hands once more before releasing them. Call me when you get back to Boston, Eleanor said. Let me know how everything went. I will, Richard promised, sliding into the car. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, watching as the black car pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, carrying Richard Harrington back to his world, a world now forever altered by their chance encounter. As she turned to re-enter the hospital to visit Loretta and share the news of Richard's incredible gift, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever connection had formed between her and Richard, whether friendship, mutual respect, or something indefinable, had served its purpose. They had each given the other something valuable. Eleanor had given Richard a second chance to reevaluate his life and priorities. Richard had given Eleanor the opportunity to once again make a meaningful difference in someone's life. And now we've come full circle, back to where we started, with an act of kindness between strangers that rippled outward, transforming not just their lives, but the lives of those around them. Eleanor Williams, a retired black nurse with silver-streaked hair and steady hands, had saved more than just Richard Harrington's life that day in the hospital bathroom. She had helped save his soul, reminding him of the humanity he had misplaced somewhere along his journey through a privileged but empty existence. As Eleanor pushed through the hospital doors, returning to the familiar corridors where she had spent so much of her life, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most profound connections are formed in the most unexpected moments, when we are vulnerable, when we are authentic, when we reach across the divisions of race and class and age to recognize the shared humanity that binds us all. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing and share your thoughts in the comments.